All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Today, we're talking about chapter 14, which is called Europe in the Atlantic World, 1550 to 1660. And there's actually a lot of stuff in this chapter. As far as what I want to talk about during our Zoom meeting, I just want to focus on two or three of the topics from today's chapter. And then I posted a series of short videos on the Canvas site, which you guys will hopefully find useful to talk about some of the other topics that are covered in the chapter. So I posted a video on Atlantic slavery. We're going to talk about the slave trade today in the Zoom session, but if you want more information, there's a YouTube video from the Crash Course YouTube series called Crash Course World History Atlantic Slave Trade. And then there's another Crash Course World History video called Spanish Empire, which talks about the long-term implications of the Spanish Empire in the New World on the politics and economics of Europe. And then one of the other topics that gets really explored in this chapter are the various wars of religion, the wars of religion in France, the 30 Years' War in Germany, and the English Civil War in England. I posted a link to a YouTube video called Crash Course European History, the English Civil War, which looks in good detail at the various conflicts in England between king and parliament and between the Puritans and the Anglicans during the English Civil War. And then finally, a topic a lot of students find interesting is the history of witchcraft. And the witchcraft craze, the burning of witches, was primarily a phenomenon not of the Middle Ages, as many people imagine, but of the early modern world, the period we're studying right now in the aftermath of the Renaissance and the Reformation. And so I posted a video, a Crash Course European History video on witchcraft on the Canvas site as well. And so I do hope you get a chance to look at that. So right now, I want to talk about something that I think we touched on earlier, a week or two ago, and that is the Columbian Exchange. So the main theme, or one of the main themes of this chapter is the Atlantic world, the idea that after the age of exploration, the world ends up becoming much larger, including North and South America, in addition to Africa, Europe, and Asia. And the Atlantic Ocean goes from being a major barrier between these different regions to being something that actively connects the old world and the new world together. And one of the big consequences of the connection between the old world and the new world is the Columbian Exchange, the movement of disease, food, animals, plants, people between the old world and the new world, and between the new world and the old world. And I think we may have talked about this before, but I just want to touch on it again. I want to look at the four major things that move between the old world and the new world and the new world and the old world. And those are disease, plants or food, animals, and then people. So disease, we talked before about how smallpox makes its way from Europe into North and South America. Smallpox wasn't the only disease that made this transition. And so, believe it or not, none of the major endemic diseases that we are used to, smallpox, cholera, influenza, typhoid, measles, malaria, bubonic plague, none of them were present in North and South America. All of them developed in Europe, Africa, and Asia, largely as a result of the connection between people and large domestic animals, herds of domestic animals. In North and South America, there really was only one large domesticatable animal. That was the llama in parts of South America. And so a lot of those animal-based diseases that are so important in human history in Europe, Africa, and Asia just weren't present in the New World. And so smallpox, cholera, influenza, typhoid, measles, malaria, and the bubonic plague all traveled from Europe, Africa, and Asia into the New World as a result of the Columbian Exchange. And that resulted in a death total of approximately 90% of the people who lived in North and South America. The Native American populations of North and South America died in vast numbers because of these diseases. And oftentimes they died of these diseases many years before they had any contact with Europeans, because those diseases traveled in front of European exploration. Once those European explorers made their way to the New World at all, those diseases spread within Native American communities and wiped out huge populations even before the Europeans arrived. So Europeans often arrived and found empty cities and tribes that had been decimated by disease, and they never even got to see the powerful, complex societies that existed in North and South America before those disease regimes took over. Interestingly, there was at least one major disease that traveled the other direction, that traveled from the New World to the Old World, and that was syphilis. Sexually transmitted disease syphilis was not recorded in Europe before 1493. And Columbus's sailors appear to have brought syphilis back from the New World into the Old World. And when it first arrived in Europe, it was incredibly deadly. Today, we don't think of syphilis as being really a deadly disease, but in its earliest forms in Europe, it was. It resulted in insanity, people's fingers and toes and ears and nose falling off, all kinds of major side effects. And it was a huge deal. And syphilis ravaged Europe in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Now, as far as food goes, the single most important food that traveled between the New World and the Old World was potatoes. And if you look at the demographic history of the world, so demography is the history of human populations and the rising and falling population numbers and things like that, we see only a handful of demographic transitions. So in the Stone Age, fertility was relatively low and mortality was relatively low, and populations were basically steady in the hunter-gatherer period. And then when agriculture is invented, fertility goes up and mortality goes up. Fertility goes up because there's a lot more food and people are able to stay in one place for long periods of time when they invent agriculture. And mortality goes up because of all those diseases that come along with animal husbandry, and also because of the poorer diet that goes along with agriculture. And so we see fertility go up, mortality go up. Fertility goes up a little bit more than mortality does, and so populations begin to grow rapidly. And then we see another transition in the 1700s when fertility stays high and mortality drops dramatically. And historians have always wondered why in the 1700s mortality begins to fall so dramatically. People have imagined that maybe it was because of better medicine or better living conditions or things like that. And that just isn't true. They didn't have any better medicine, and their living conditions were still pretty awful in the 1700s. They didn't have public health and clean streets and things like that. They still drank water which was, contaminated by waste and other things. And so it wasn't that. But now most historians think that the reason that mortality begins to fall in the 1700s and population really explodes dramatically is because of the potato. Because potatoes are able to be grown on small plots of land. They don't require the best soil. They grow underground, so it doesn't particularly matter if the land is flat or if it's hilly. It doesn't require a great deal of effort to grow, and they're very nutritious. And in fact, you can live almost entirely off of potatoes for a long period of time. You can live for years off of potatoes and relatively few other foods. And as a result of the spread of potatoes, poor people all around the world in Europe and Africa and Asia no longer have to die of famine. And the number of famines declines dramatically once you have potatoes available. And so, believe it or not, potatoes are one of the most consequential foods in human history. And the modern day populations of the world, where we have billions of people, would not have been possible without the introduction of potatoes to the old world in the 16 and 1700s. So that is one of the more surprising facts of the Columbian Exchange. Potatoes weren't the only food that traveled between the New World and the Old World. So a number of foods, corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, avocados, chili peppers, pineapples, and cocoa, the source of chocolate, all come from the New World to the Old World. And a number of foods traveled the other direction. So wheat, sugar, bananas, rice, and grapes all come from the old world to the new world. And some of those would have huge consequences, especially sugar. Sugar became the dominant crop of slave produced agriculture in the New World. And so in South America and in the Caribbean, sugar plantations became hugely important for the Atlantic slave trade. And sugar was not native to the New World. This was a crop that was imported to North America and South America by Europeans from the Old World. Animals also traveled between the New World and the Old World. So the most consequential is probably horses. So the Spanish explorers brought horses with them when they went to America, and some of those horses got free, and herds of wild horses spread across North and South America, radically altered the lifestyles of Native Americans who encountered them. So especially those Native American tribes in the Central Plains and out west in North America had their entire cultures radically transformed by horses. They went from sedentary agriculture to being migrating hunters living on horseback. But also all of the animals associated with European and Asian agriculture also traveled to the New World. So pigs, chickens, sheep, and cows all came from the old world to the new world and brought with them entirely new forms of agriculture. So all of the agriculture that existed in North and South America existed without the use of large domesticatable mammals to help plow the fields. And so agriculture was very human labor intensive in North and South America, and that began to change for the first time with the Columbian Exchange. All right, probably the most important thing, though, that came about because of the Columbian Exchange was the Atlantic slave trade. So Portuguese sailors began capturing and purchasing slaves from African traders and tribes in the 1400s and began bringing those slaves back to Europe. As Europeans began to colonize North and South America, the demand for slave labor exploded. So one of the reasons why there was such a demand for slave labor was because most of the agriculture in the New World was for profit. And so they weren't growing crops to eat, they were growing crops to sell. And some of the most expensive crops, especially sugar, were incredibly labor intensive. It was not something that a small farmer could do on their own. If you wanted to have a sugar plantation, you needed dozens and dozens of agricultural laborers to work for you. Now, in Europe, when they needed large numbers of agricultural laborers in the Middle Ages, they turned to serfdom and situations like that. That was not possible in the New World. So they brought over many European migrants. Poor Europeans traveled to the New World initially with the plan of working in agriculture. But one of the features of the New World was that there was a great deal of available farmland. Unlike in Europe, where farmland was very rare and hard to come by, unused farmland, I should say. In North and South America, there was a great deal of farmland available, mainly because the Native American populations had largely died out or been conquered or been enslaved. And so a lot of the people who migrated to North and South America, the white European migrants, decided they didn't want to work on sugar plantations. They wanted to become small independent farmers, and many of them left the agricultural workforce and became farmers in their own right, small farmers. There was an attempt to enslave the Native American population to have them work on these plantations. However, the diseases that were ravaging Native American populations made it very difficult to have a large enough labor force of Native American slaves. And as a result, European colonists turned towards African slaves as a labor source. And they purchased a lot of African slaves. So there's approximately 12 million slaves that were put on ships from West Africa and sailed to North and South America. 12 million between the 1500s and the 1800s when the slave trade finally ended. About 1.5 million slaves, almost 10% of the African captives, died on ship during the Middle Passage between Africa and North and South America. To put this in perspective, the African slave trade did not just extend to North and South America. There was also an active African slave trade moving eastward towards the Middle East and Asia. And about 6 million Africans were traded as slaves in the Middle East and Asia. And then another 8 million Africans were traded internally in Africa in slave trading. And so we have a total of around 26 million Africans who were enslaved. About 12 million, 1/3 of them, ended up in North and South America. About 4 million people died in the process of being captured or as the result of slave trade. So we're talking in a world where Europe's population was only around 36 million. And it's a little harder to estimate the population of Africa, but it was not that much larger than that. 30 million people over the course of 300 years were enslaved or died because of enslavement in Africa. So this is an incredibly huge human toll that slavery took. Now, most of the African slaves who were traded to North and South America ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. About 1/3 of all African slaves in the Atlantic slave trade ended up in Brazil, and about 1/4, 25%, ended up in the Caribbean. Only 3% of slaves in the Atlantic slave trade arrived in North America. And that may surprise people because we tend in America, North America, and the US to think of the slave trade as being American centered. But really, it was Brazil and the Caribbean that were where the vast majority of slaves went. The reason why was because the disease regimes and working conditions in the Caribbean and Brazil were so awful that the death rate among slaves was radically higher than it was in North and South America. So North and South America, North America, I should say, in North America, they actually had a regime where slaves were able to reproduce their own population. So the death rate in North America was low enough that slave populations would have children and those children would be enslaved, and the population of slaves grew naturally in North America. In Brazil and the Caribbean, the death rate was so high that they had to constantly import new slaves, and that meant that the number of slaves arriving in those regions was so radically higher. A concept that you should really keep in mind when thinking about the Atlantic slave trade is called the triangular trade. And that is a triangle. If you can imagine a map of the world, a triangle that connects Africa to the New World, to Europe, and then back to Africa. The triangular trade was a series of exchanges that was made between these different regions so that, for instance, slaves from Africa would be sailed over to the Caribbean and they would be traded in the Caribbean for molasses, so processed sugar. And that molasses would then be traded to New England, where it was produced into rum. And then that rum was traded back in Africa for more slaves. Similarly, another triangular trade, there were multiple triangular trades. Another one was manufactured goods from England being traded in Africa for slaves. the slaves would be sent to North America and traded for tobacco. And then the tobacco is shipped to Europe and traded for more manufactured goods, which would be traded to Africa for more slaves, traded for more tobacco, traded for more manufactured goods, and so on in a triangular exchange. All right. Now, does anyone have any questions about the Columbian Exchange or the Atlantic slave trade?
Chose to enslave some of them. Was there anything behind why they did it? Was it like, had they committed crimes, or was it just anyone that they could find?
Well, that's a good question. So we'll look at a couple different aspects. So first off, why did the Europeans want African slaves? The main reason appears to be that Europeans viewed Africans as being the other, right? And so there was a widespread conviction that it wasn't proper to enslave European Christians. And so therefore, the prospects of coming up with a slave population in Europe was difficult. And so they turned to Africa, where slavery already existed in some form. And the African rulers were often trying to trade slaves for European manufactured goods and weapons and things like that. Now, in Africa, there was a couple different situations. So first off, slavery existed in Africa before Europeans arrived, but it was very different than the kind of slavery that gets practiced in North and South America. So for instance, the biggest difference is that in North and South America, the children of slaves were considered to be slaves, whereas in Africa, the children of African slaves in Africa were considered to be free. And so there was a radical difference there. Also, in many cultures in West Africa, slaves were treated as part of the family unit. They were less important than children and sons, but they were treated as part of the family, and oftentimes would achieve freedom after a few years of slavery. They could marry outside of their master's control. They would have children who would be raised as free people and citizens of their society. It was a very different culture. And now the slaves in African societies were primarily a result of warfare. So there was constant fighting between West African tribes who didn't think of themselves as being sort of West African or African. They thought of themselves in terms of their tribal identities, and they really didn't like other tribes. And they were constantly fighting, and the captives from those wars were enslaved and used as agricultural laborers back in their home community. Also, as Europeans began trading for slaves, a number of African countries made it so that criminals would be enslaved as part of their punishment for crimes. And so more and more crimes became punished with slavery, and then those slaves were traded to Europeans who would then bring them over to North and South America. As the slave trade became more lucrative, African kingdoms and tribes began going to war for the sole purpose of capturing more slaves. And some African regions became known for slave trading. And so those people would go to war against neighboring tribes or even distantly into the center region of Africa and bring back hundreds of captives for the purpose of selling into slavery. Very rarely did Europeans actually go and capture slaves themselves, mainly because Europeans didn't have good protection from the diseases, particularly malaria in Africa. And the life expectancy of Europeans in sort of mainland Africa and West Africa was only a couple years after they arrived, because the diseases just weren't familiar to European immune systems. It wasn't until they developed medicine for malaria in the 1800s and 1900s that it became possible for Europeans to really go into Central Africa in large numbers. So it's a really interesting question. I was reading on this preparing for the lecture, and I was kind of surprised that when the English abolished the slave trade in the 1800s, a number of African kingdoms, in particular the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, protested the end of slavery because they saw slavery as their primary export. and they didn't want to lose the access to wealth and technology and ammunition and weapons from the Europeans that the end of slavery would bring. But the vast majority of people in West Africa were greatly relieved when slavery ended and the slave trade ended, because they were the victims. It was only a minority of Africans who were involved in capturing slaves and selling them. The vast majority of Africans in West Africa were the victims of the slave. Any other questions?
I was wondering, so when it came to like taking care of the slaves, like since they were using slaves as, you know, they were trading for them, you would think they'd take better care of them. Like, you know, if you're trading something, you normally take good care of it. So why did they have so many that died on the way to where they were trading them?
Well, I mean, I think it just has to do with the conditions of it. So when you think about slavery in the Caribbean, so you've got this middle passage where 10% of the slaves die on the ships. And when you look at those accounts of slave ships, I think the way they thought about it was they just placed so little value on the lives of the slaves that they were willing to stuff those ships sort of over full with the expectation that a number of them would die, but they would still make a profit in the end. And so the profit was all that mattered. But when they arrived in the Caribbean, they were placed in what were called seasoning camps. And in those seasoning camps, 10 to 20% of the slaves would die in the first year because they were not familiar with the diseases and the conditions in that part of the world. It was believed by the Europeans that African slaves were more immune to tropical diseases and therefore would do better than Europeans and Native Americans. And they probably did do better, but the conditions in the Caribbean were so awful that Europeans were also dying 10 to 20% of the population every year. And so I think life was just cheap in general in the colonies, and African life was less valued, and therefore they were less concerned. The profits were so high from slave trading that even with 10 to 20% of the slaves dying in the process of transit, it was still a lucrative business. All right, so I want to look at one of the documents from the document reader. If you have your document reader, let's open up to page 507. So we talked about the Reformation. One of the consequences of the Protestant Reformation was the widespread warfare between Catholic and Protestant Europeans. And one series of wars ended in 1555 with a peace called the Religious Peace of Augsburg. And I just want to make one thing clear, because this document, it's pretty straightforward. It kind of explains what the rules are for German Christians at the end of this war. And it says basically that some of them are going to be Catholic. That's what they call the old religion, the Catholic Church. And some of them are going to be Lutheran. And they talk about the Augsburg Confession. And the Augsburg Confession is the Lutheran Christians. But what isn't entirely clear in this first paragraph labeled 15 is that the decision about which parts of Europe are going to be Lutheran and which parts are going to be Catholic is solely at the discretion of the ruler. Remember, Germany is divided into 300 principalities, each one ruled by a prince. And those princes each get to decide, do I want my principality to be Catholic or Lutheran? And whatever they decide goes for the entire region. So it's not like every Christian gets to decide if they want to be Catholic or Lutheran. The ruler of each region gets to decide if that region is going to be Catholic or Lutheran. And if you look on page 508 in the paragraph number 24, it says, in case our subjects, whether belonging to the old religion or the Augsburg Confession, should intend leaving their homes with their wives and children in order to settle in another, they shall be hindered neither in the sale of their estates after due payment of the local taxes, nor injured in their honor. In other words, the only thing you could do if you were Catholic and your prince became a Lutheran, or if you were Lutheran and your prince became a Catholic, was you could pack up your house, sell all your stuff, take your wife and your children, and you could move. You could go live somewhere else. That was the extent of toleration. Also, back on page 507, paragraph 17 says, however, all such as do not belong to the two above named religions shall not be included in the present peace, but be totally excluded from it. And what they're talking about there is non-Lutheran Protestants. So if you were a Calvinist or a Zwinglian or an Anglican or an Anabaptist or any other Protestant group that wasn't Lutheran, you weren't allowed to have any religious rights in Germany at the end of this war. So a lot of times people look at the Augsburg Peace and say this is the first example of religious toleration in Europe, where two different Christian religions both tolerate each other's existence. But it's important to note that this is a really limited definition of tolerance, right? This is not what we would think of as tolerance today. This is something a little different than that. All right. So do take a look at those videos posted on YouTube on the Canvas site. There's 4 of them. I mean, obviously I can't make you watch all of them, but I hope that you watch at least a few of them because they go into more detail in some of the topics that are in this chapter and are very, I think, useful. All right. Any questions before we go?
Wasn't there like still a lot of slavery during this time, like with the Ottomans and like in the Mediterranean?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, about 8 million slaves from Africa actually were traded into the Ottoman Empire and into Asia and the Middle East. And another 8 million were traded within Africa itself during the internal slave trade. So there's widespread slavery everywhere. And Africa really is the source of the vast majority of slaves, both in the Middle East and in North America, South America, Europe, and Africa itself. So the slave trade, not just the Atlantic slave trade, but the world slave trade has a huge impact on Africa from the 15th to the 19th centuries. It's one of the most destructive events in African history by far.